Let's get one thing straight. The world is shifting and a new oil order is emerging. The days of cheap, easy energy are behind us. Recently, OPEC made a big move by cutting oil production by 2 million barrels a day. And as expected, people are panicking. Yes, fuel prices are heading up and energy inflation is going to stick around. But what most people are missing is the bigger picture. The global order is evolving. This isn't just a short-term spike. Inflation is likely to remain elevated and cheap oil is off the table, maybe for good. Remember back in 2020 when crude oil dropped to around $20 a barrel? That kind of pricing is not coming back anytime soon, if ever. OPEC's decision to reduce output during a time of energy crisis tells us two key things. First, they're willing to ignore the pressure from the US, and second, they're prioritizing their own profits and stability. Let's face it, oil is a finite resource. Any country that has it will naturally want to sell it at a higher price to maximize earnings. Whether it's Saudi Arabia, Russia, or the US, that logic holds. And here's the part people often overlook. Fossil fuels still power our world. Over 80% of global energy comes from oil, gas, and coal. Whoever controls oil controls everything. Now, a lot of people assume oil prices are controlled purely by producers like OPEC. While that's partly true, they can raise or cut supply, there's another major factor at play here: demand. And this is where the United States, and more specifically the Federal Reserve, comes in. If OPEC controls supply, the Federal Reserve has massive influence over global demand for oil. It's a concept that's rarely talked about, but honestly, it's incredibly important. Yes, the US is a top oil producer, but it only became a net exporter briefly in 2020 and 2021, and the net export figure was just 160,000 barrels per day. That's tiny compared to OPEC's 2 million barrels per day cut. So when it comes to impacting oil prices, the US plays a different game. It manipulates demand. And how do they do that? Through interest rates. The Federal Reserve uses rate hikes to slow down demand, and in turn, energy consumption. Since March, the Fed has been raising rates in an effort to tame energy inflation. It's really the only real tool they've got. But here's what most people get wrong. These rate hikes don't just affect the US economy. The entire world runs on the US dollar. Over 70% of global trade, especially commodities like oil, is conducted in dollars. So when the Fed raises rates, two things happen globally. First, interest rates rise across the board, making it harder for people and businesses to borrow money. This slows economies down, reducing demand for oil. Second, foreign currencies weaken against the dollar. That makes buying oil, which is priced in dollars, more expensive. For example, if the British pound falls 20% against the dollar, oil becomes 20% more expensive for UK buyers, even if the oil price itself doesn't change. This is demand destruction, not by changing supply, but by weakening global buying power. So if the US can't flood the world with oil, it just crushes demand through higher interest rates, triggering a global recession. When people are broke, they buy less oil. This tactic has worked in the past. If you look at the Fed funds rate compared to global crude oil prices, it's clear. When rates rise, oil prices tend to fall, because demand just can't hold up. On the flip side, when rates drop near zero, borrowing becomes easy, demand rebounds, and oil prices shoot up. That's how the Fed influences oil, through global dollar dominance. And now OPEC is pushing back. By slashing production, OPEC is saying, if the Fed wants to squeeze demand, we'll tighten supply. It's a calculated move to keep oil prices, and their revenues, high. Saudi Arabia even stated the cut was necessary to respond to rising interest rates in the West and weakening global demand. They know a downturn is coming, especially with winter approaching, so they acted early to protect their income. This is a power struggle. On one side, the Fed controls the dollar. On the other, OPEC controls oil. That old energy model, abundant, affordable fuel, is disappearing. And it's critical to understand how much that mattered to the developed world. Take Germany, for example. It's long been one of the most advanced economies in the world. And if you look at its GDP, aside from dips in 2008 and 2020, the growth has been consistently strong, sometimes hitting 4% annually. That's impressive. especially when compared to the UN's 2% global growth benchmark. How is that possible? Cheap energy. The entire Eurozone was buying low-cost gas from Russia. According to Credit Suisse's Zoltan Pozsar, roughly $2 trillion of German industrial value depended on just $20 billion worth of Russian gas. That's an incredible return. And looking back, gas was incredibly cheap for Europe for more than a decade. For years, gas prices in Europe hovered under 20 euros per megawatt hour. That cheap energy helped Europe thrive. But when the war broke out and sanctions followed, energy costs skyrocketed, hitting 200 euros, a tenfold increase. That's why Europe is now sliding into a recession. Germany once expects one in 2023, and with soaring energy costs, industries can't grow, and consumers are feeling the squeeze. We're heading into a new era, one where energy prices won't drop back to old levels. That shift will touch every part of our lives. The head of Singapore's central bank recently summed it up perfectly. The age of cheap money, cheap labor, and cheap energy is over. Interest rates aren't going back to zero like they did over the past 20 years. So imagine a world where oil prices stay elevated, in the $60 to $100 range for the long haul. Inflation will stay stubbornly high. The Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target? That's probably out of reach. And to prevent inflation from spiraling out of control, interest rates will have to stay elevated too. With Russia no longer sending gas to Europe and OPEC ignoring Washington's demands, the West is facing serious headwinds. Now let's picture a world split into three major energy blocks, each controlling its share of global oil exports. First, the NATO bloc, which includes oil-producing allies of the United States like Canada, Norway, and of course, the US itself. Second, the OPEC bloc, made up of countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. And third, the Russia bloc, mainly selling to Asia due to Western sanctions. Yes, this is a simplified picture, but it helps explain what's coming. Each bloc will serve its own interests. For example, 97% of Canada's oil already goes straight to the US. Norway is practically the exclusive supplier for much of Europe and Russia. Their options are limited, so they'll keep selling to China and others in Asia. That cheap oil in the East? It's staying in the East. China might re-export some to the West, but at a hefty markup, like they're already doing with Russian gas. OPEC, on the other hand, is likely to keep selling to everyone, but on its own terms, and they have the leverage. OPEC produces 40% of global crude and supplies 60% of the world's oil exports. They flipped the script. Now, instead of letting rate hikes destroy demand, they're cutting supply to keep prices stable or rising. Even if the Federal Reserve hikes interest rates to 10%, it won't matter much if OPEC keeps squeezing supply. The supply side still has the upper hand in the oil market. This marks the end of the globalized world we've gotten used to. Cheap goods, low inflation, and easy access, that era is gone. Higher energy costs will push up prices across the board, especially food and raw materials. And one major reason? Trust between countries is breaking down. We're seeing a major shift: friendshoring. The United States is now moving manufacturing and supply chains away from the cheapest countries and toward reliable allies. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen once said the U.S. favors moving supply chains to trusted countries to secure access to markets and reduce risk for both America and its partners. That means less reliance on China and Russia. It also means shifting away from Taiwanese chip production, due to the island's proximity to China, and moving more work to South Korea instead. On paper, it sounds good, more security, but that comes with higher prices. For example, the United States is ramping up tech restrictions to block China's chip industry from advancing, but China is already responding, building its own chip companies to become self-sufficient. Yes, Chinese tech might cost more in the short term, but eventually they'll catch up and start competing globally. That will push United States costs higher again. There's always a ripple effect, and that same pattern will apply to oil and gas too. We need to brace for a future where oil doesn't get much cheaper. Here's the truth. Many people are still living in the past, expecting ultra-low interest rates to return and inflation to drop below 2%. But that's not happening, not anytime soon. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Oil-rich nations are putting their own interests first, And the Federal Reserve has no real tools left, just rate hikes. That's why leverage is getting riskier than ever. If you've been borrowing money to invest, you're walking on thin ice. The old playbook of borrowing at 2 to 3% and putting it into the S&P for a 10% return, it's likely broken. If oil prices rise again and the economy slows while rates jump higher, you're stuck. Imagine borrowing in 2021, and now your interest rate has tripled, while your investments are down 20 to 30%. You've just become another Wall Street casualty. So what's the best move now? Stay liquid, stack cash. If you're buying something, pay with cash. There's no reason to take on big debt right now. Interest payments will eat your gains. Be smart. Don't let the system trap you. When the next wave of demand destruction hits, you'll want to be ready, with cash, to scoop up opportunities. So what do you think? Is the world ready for a new oil order? Can economies survive long-term high energy prices? Let me know in the comments. Stay safe, smash that like button, and subscribe so we can keep unpacking these wild times together.